Welcome to our session on growth in a divided nation, where we're going to use our wealth of behavioural data to explore the divergence in consumer experience over the last 18 months. I'm joined by Lucy and Craig, who are going to help me talk through different angles on this question. So over the last 18 months, we spent a lot of time talking about change that's already happened and change that might happen in the future. But we've tended to do that in the form of averages. And if we're honest, we do that because it's easy. It's easier to talk about and it's easier to understand. But as we get under the skin of what's changed, I think it's clear that those averages are becoming less useful, because what we're seeing is a divergence in behaviour, as I've described. So a divergence in how we're living our lives, a divergence in what we're prioritising, and the divergence in the amount of money that we have at our disposal. So in the next half an hour, we're going to take you through three lenses on those changes. We're going to talk about altered means, we're going to talk about altered priorities, but we're going to start with altered context, which is the section that Lucy's going to take you through.
So the context is really important, and what we're talking about here when we think about context is really the context of our day-to-day lives and how that's changed over the course of the pandemic and the lockdowns that we've all lived through. Now, one of the biggest changes that we saw during 2020 and even into 2021 is working from home. Pre-pandemic, around about 19% of the population were working from home. And it's easy to think because most of us were doing it, that now everybody is doing it. But actually, the reality is that around about 26% of people, so about a quarter of the population, were working from home during the pandemic. And even when we look at the height of the restrictions, the most lockdown that we were throughout the whole period, it was only around a third of the population in the UK that were working from home during that time. So it's really important that we take that into consideration when we consider the different contexts. It's one of these examples of things where it's very easy to assume that everyone's lives are like us. But whilst it was potentially only a quarter of the population that's working from home, it's still a significant amount of people. So I'm going to spend the next few slides exploring what that means in terms of those people who were working from home, but also for those that weren't, and what that's done in terms of changing the behaviours that we've seen. So one of the biggest changes that we saw, understandably, was the number of lunchtime occasions that we were having outside of the home. With more people working from home, there was understandably a decline of 34 million lunchtime occasions had during the working week outside of the home. And that decline was driven predominantly by ABC1 workers. So 65% of that decline came from those in those categories. Those people who would, again, we would assume, tend to be those who are working from home. But even moving away from that and thinking about the wider context and other people in the rest of the UK, actually those people who were still travelling to work also reduced their spend in terms of the amount that they were spending in lunchtime occasions away from home. So around about 7 billion was lost from those people. That's a massive amount of money. And it's easy to see why that happened for various different reasons. We're going to talk about people's priorities in a little bit, and Craig's going to talk about that in more detail. But some people simply just didn't feel safe enough to go into cafes or into shops to buy their lunch when they're working outside of the home. And we've seen that reflected as well in terms of the particular products that people were buying. So lunchtime staples, sandwiches, dropped by around about 50% during the pandemic, which has been absolutely massive. And again, that's driven by the fact that, as I say, it's priorities, whether or not people feel safe going into shops to buy their lunch, but also availability. As we know, during the pandemic, a lot of shops had to close either temporarily or longer term, which affected what people were able to buy. So we're thinking about moving away from just the working week and what that means and the impact that has. Whilst not everyone was working from home, we were all staying at home much, much more than we ever have done before. And this chart really clearly demonstrates that massive drop-off that we saw in March and April of last year, when suddenly people were all at home much, much more than they had been, and the decline in terms of the amount of time spent in travel or at work. So what does that actually mean when we look at the different categories and the different behaviours that we exhibit? Well, for many people, they've changed what they were wearing. And loungewear has been a clear winner in terms of the changes that people have exhibited. So the reasons that people were giving for buying loungewear massively increased in terms of relying on clothes that were comfortable to wear around the house. And we also saw the spend on loungewear specifically growing by 88% between 2019 and 2020. And even as we go into 2021, that increase has continued. So we've seen 2% growth in spend even over the last, over 2021 on top of 2020. So obviously it's a category that's continuing to go from strength to strength. But it's not just about what we're wearing and how when we're at home, it's also about what we're consuming. I already mentioned that people are eating out during the working week far, far less. But one area that saw massive growth during the times that we were locked down and unable to leave the house was actually delivery at lunchtime. There's a 4.5 times increase in terms of the number of deliveries into the home at lunchtime during the working week, which is a huge amount. And again, a lot of that was driven by people who were working from home. So spend on those occasions increased by 3% for those who had previously been commuting to work and were now working from home. But again, it's not just about what we eat or what we wear, it's also about our personal care. And one of the things that we saw during the period of lockdown was that we were spending less time or less money on certain types of occasions. The 3 months to June 2020 compared to the 3 months to March 2020, we saw a decline of 40% in terms of the number of occasions of fragrance. That's probably understandable. Fragrance, aftershave or perfume tends to be something that you might wear on a special occasion, and almost certainly when you're going to be leaving the house. So staying at home more probably correlates to fewer of those occasions. But potentially slightly more interesting or worrying, depending on the way you want to look at it, is that we saw a decline of around about a third in deodorant usage from men who are working from home. So obviously people not necessarily thinking so much or caring so much about what they might smell like when they're not leaving the house. This has manifested itself in other uses as well. We've seen a decline overall in around about half of the number of makeup occasions for women over the period of the pandemic. And again, you can see the difference in terms of the number of occasions for eye makeup for women working from home is far fewer than those for those women who are not working from home. So again, who are leaving the house more often. So obviously it's having an impact where we are, where we're spending time is impacting what we're wearing, what we're eating, and what we're putting on our face and how we're making ourselves smell when we're leaving the house. So what's going to happen ongoing? Well, there's been lots in the news about the fact that certain companies are suggesting that they're going to reduce the pay of people who are working from home, potentially to disincentivize people from doing so. There was also some talk by companies such as Goldman Sachs about working from home being an aberration and something that would quickly revert to normal. And whilst they've sort of pared back on that very strong stance, we still know that they see people going into the office as being one of the key drivers of their success, and they are encouraging people to come back into the office more. So that's what the companies are saying. They're saying, yes, we want people to come back into the office more than they have been. But what do consumers actually think? What do workers actually think in terms of what they're going to be doing over the coming months and years? When we look at the data, what we can actually see is that those people who have been working 5 days a week from home during the pandemic are actually expecting to continue to work from home more frequently than they were before. So that big spike in the number of people working 5 days a week from home during pandemic declines when we talk about what's going to happen in the near future. But we're seeing that distributed across the 1, 2, 3 and 4 working days from home. And that divergence is going to mean a divergence in terms of consumers' behaviour, both in terms of thinking about what they might be doing on a week-by-week or a day-by-day basis. So when we break that down, what does that mean ongoing? Well, there's a big difference for someone who's working from home who might think that actually they've got used to making their own lunch and they're going to continue doing that. But then again, they might think when they do go into the office, they're going to treat themselves and seeing it as a special occasion to go out for lunch with colleagues. Likewise, they may have got used to working in more comfortable clothes when they're at home, but might see going into the office as an opportunity to dress up and wear something a bit more interesting, a bit different. And finally, whilst they may be enjoying not wearing makeup at the moment, there's always the chance that they will take that time when they do go out to put more effort into putting on makeup. So what we can see is there's a massive divergence in terms of how people are going to react to the new context that they're living in. But obviously, a lot of that is going to depend not just on the context that they're living in, but the priorities as well, which Craig is going to talk about now.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So, as referenced a couple of times already, there's many different ways that people prioritise their time and their spend over the course of the pandemic. And we want to delve into two ends of the spectrum across 2 points of the pandemic to see if we can unpick a little bit more detail about who reacted in what way. So we're going to look at these two examples. First of all, did you start and use the start of the pandemic to get fit, or was it a time when you wanted to treat yourself to manage what was potentially a difficult period? And once restrictions have lifted, especially since we went past Freedom Day, have you been out and about socialising? Have you been getting back to nightclubs? Or are you still remaining cautious and keeping yourself potentially safe? So let's talk about health then as a starting point. At the start of the pandemic to now, we've seen 2.5 million more adults actively tracking their fitness, which is a big growth on the existing base of already 16 million people that were already doing this. This has manifested in many different ways. We've seen some people willing to make big outlays on things like Peloton equipment, and the share price of Peloton has skyrocketed and by sixfold over the course of the pandemic. But there's other ways people are trying to be healthy as well. We saw the vitamins, minerals and supplements category growing by 19% over 2020, much higher than the rate of its wider healthcare category and much higher than FMCG. And actually, importantly, this has continued into 2021 as well. Now, if we try and identify who the healthy buyers are, we have attitudinal statements that we put to our panel every year. And if we isolate the people that are responding positively to some of the healthy statements, such as I restrict my sugar intake, or I try to lead a healthy lifestyle, we can then see that the people who are trying to prioritize health are really those ones that either have the luxury of time or money to do so. So you can see the biggest over-indexes in the higher social classes, class A, B, and the post-family life stages, such as empty nesters and in particular retired people. On the other end of the spectrum, young families, for example, so families with young kids either don't have the time or don't have the money to prioritize spending against their health. So the other aspect of that then is indulgence. And we've seen indulgent brands rocket into the top 10 fastest growing FMCG brands over 2020. You can see a snapshot of the broader kind of behaviour, of course, of what happened over the pandemic, with Carex, hand sanitizer being the fastest growing brand, the minerals and supplement brand Centrum growing really well as well, but brands like Milka and Lindt jumping up into the top 10 for the first time on really substantial growth, based on people giving themselves a little treats and indulging themselves at home. But since April, we've had the ability to go out and socialise more than we have been able to in the past. So has that meant that everybody's going out and engaging in those kind of activities, or is there still some hesitation among some groups? When we look at group social occasions, as I try to measure this kind of appetite, we see that actually it's jumping back. It's had a really strong summer. It's grown in terms of the number of occasions versus where it was last year. In particular, pubs and bars and restaurants, venues more associated with special occasions or really good social occasions, are operating around 70% of their pre-COVID levels, which shows that there is high engagement there with those categories and people willing to go back to those venues. But that's not necessarily even across the board and across all demographic groups. So if we try and understand which age groups in particular have returned to those kind of occasions, the percentages here show the percent of those people that have returned to those occasions over the summertime versus their pre-pandemic levels by different age groups. So you can see the 35 to 54-year-old group in particular have the highest percentage of people returning. But actually, there's really strong returning behaviours as well amongst the over 55s. There's fast growth on where it was this time last year, 26 percentage points. And actually, as a group, they account for the largest overall proportion of out-of-home social dining occasions. So does that mean that they're happy returning to all kinds of out-of-home venues? Well, not necessarily. If we look at cinemas, for example, cinemas have reopened after a period of closure. They've reopened in full force after Freedom Day. And if we compare the average audience since they've been reopened versus a pre-pandemic average, you can see the contribution coming from the older age groups, the 55 plus, is down versus where we would have expected it beforehand. So there's that definite, there's the signs that people are potentially prioritizing either social occasions, or perhaps there's a perceived risk that's causing some hesitation about going to an enclosed space and sitting with a group of strangers potentially. Of course, film studios have been trying to navigate this risk and trying to hit the times when you're going to get the biggest potential audience. So we've seen James Bond, for example. Daniel Craig's final outing as Bond has moved its release date 3 or 4 times to mitigate not just cinema closures, but also times when they're open but weren't expected to get a big audience. And I guess 55 plus will be a core part of that audience as well, with that group accounting for about 20% of Spectre's audience sizes. But of course, over that time, people have found other ways of consuming film and TV, and that's kind of referenced on the final poster on the right-hand side, only in theatres. So over the course of the pandemic, people were able to choose other ways of consuming film products. Some films released directly on home entertainment, some went straight to streaming services. And we've seen streaming services really grow in popularity over the last 18 months. So when we take the overall relative penetration, so that's the proportion of each age group that has at least one subscription to Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Now TV, for example, we see that if we compare to the height of the pandemic, so Q1 2020, penetration amongst the 35-54 core kind of consumer group has dropped back very slightly. But actually, we're seeing really good growth in the over 55s, and actually the strongest growth by relative penetration in the 65 plus age groups. Is that potentially a substitution, or are people willing to keep that and move back to the cinema once they feel safe to do so? Of course, it's going to be really important to track that ongoing. So if we try and draw that all together and think about what the future might hold, it's good to think about where you sit on this potential scatter chart here, where is your brand or service viewed as something that's potentially safe or risky to consume, and is it an essential or is it a discretionary purchase? If we try and plot this for example, an over 55 person, and think about the start of the pandemic, it was clear that this group were prioritising their health, so that was seen as an essential activity or an essential purchase as well. For example, they all had to go grocery shopping, but that was also seen as essential, but a potential risky activity to do. If we think about the last couple of months, when restaurants have been reopened, this group again is engaging with out-of-home social occasions. That means that it's not only viewed as essential, but to a certain extent it must be viewed as safe. Whereas potentially cinema sits at the other side of that balance, where there perhaps is more of a perceived risk for this group, and that makes it more of a discretionary purchase. Netflix is discretionary as well to a certain extent, but actually there's a lot less risk involved. So we've seen that increase in popularity for that group. And as we move forward into a time when perhaps people are worried about rising cases of coronavirus, or people are worried about vaccine efficacy reducing, there might be some shifts in where these sit ongoing. So for example, people might start to worry that being in enclosed spaces, especially as outside kind of space is reduced, you might see that people are a bit more hesitant about returning to restaurants. Or perhaps once Bond does come out, we'll see that it's still viewed as risky, but it's viewed as essential, because the only way to watch Bond is in the cinema, so that's a risk worth taking. There's many factors to consider. There'll always be the factor of health versus indulgence. Of course, the type of venue you are can potentially impact people's perception of it as well. But of course, underpinning all of this as well is the means that people have to be able to afford these experiences. And with that, we'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Craig. So as Craig has alluded to at the end there, regardless of our priorities, our decisions are still going to be dictated to a large extent by the means we have to pursue those priorities. And now I'm going to explore this in the final section. And it's an interesting area, not just because we've seen contrasting experiences for consumers, but also because there's contrasting evidence about where we stand today. So if we take some of the ONS data on the amount of money people were able to save through 2020, what we see is that there was enormous spikes in net household savings through 2020. So you see in the first quarter of 2020, the number more than tripled to 90 billion in net household savings, and even in the second half of 2020, we were still at more than double normal levels. And the reason for that was, despite the fact that disposable income dropped a little bit, savings, the amount that people were spending dropped by a lot more. So the net result is that people were able to save more. So looking at this chart in isolation, you'd assume that it was boom time for consumers. Everyone's got more money in the bank. Everyone's ready and primed to go out there and spend it. But the story's a little more complex, because when we actually go and ask people how they're feeling about their financial situation, we don't see the same thing. So this is a survey we ran back in March 2020, so just after the first lockdown, and we asked people to self-classify themselves in terms of their financial situation. So they're putting themselves on a scale of anything from I've got all the money that I need and I can basically buy what I like, down to I don't have enough money to get by, which is over on the right-hand side. And what's interesting is the contrast with that result and what we saw when we did that survey again in May of this year, when contrasting what we saw on the previous chart, where we saw, in theory, people having more money in the bank. Actually, we see a growth in the struggling groups, those on the right-hand side, and a slight contraction in the comfortable groups, those on the left-hand side. So despite the message that people have got more money in the bank, actually what we're seeing is people are a bit more concerned about their financial position. It's starting to demonstrate to us that though people have made savings, those savings aren't evenly distributed across the population. What also isn't evenly distributed across the population is outlook for the future. So if we take these two groups on the extreme, so the struggling on the left-hand side, the struggling on the right-hand side and the comfortable on the left-hand side, and compare their outlook for the future, and we basically ask them, do you expect your financial position to worsen in the next 12 months? And what we see is that if you're in the struggling group, you're 5 times more likely to say yes, that you're expecting your position to worsen. So not only is there a contrast in your current position, but there's an even bigger contrast in your expectation for the next 12 months as well. And this is important not just because it exists in people's minds, but it manifests itself in differences in behaviour. So when we look at the grocery shopping behaviour of these two groups, what we see is that the expansion in spend on take-home groceries has been much faster with the comfortable group than with the struggling group, which is interesting in itself. But more interesting is the behaviour that underpins that. And specifically, that's about basket size. So if we look at the pre-pandemic period and we look at the average basket size of a struggling household compared to the average household, what we observe is that already struggling households were spending a bit less through per transaction than all households. And that's something we commonly see, that people who are having to manage their budgets are more focused on the transaction in the moment because they're thinking about their weekly outgoings or even their daily outgoings. But if we look at that data in the last 6 months, that gap has grown even larger. So that contrast between the elasticity in the amount the more affluent people are willing to spend in an individual transaction and the tight controls that the more struggling groups are having to exert over their transactions on a day-to-day basis starts to give us a sense of how we might need to adjust strategies to win with these groups. But while we talk about the struggling group, it's also important to contrast it with those people who have the luxury of a larger disposable income and feel more comfortable with their scenarios. And if we take these groups and put them in a different scenario entirely, take them out of grocery shopping and take them into on-premise food and drink consumption, we see something quite different, which is that we've seen, for everyone, we've seen a significant growth in the amount that people are willing to spend when they're having an on-premise out-of-home food and drink consumption occasion. So that would be in a restaurant or in a cafe or the like. But that growth is more than twice as big amongst social class ABs, so the more affluent group, than it is amongst the rest of the population. So an exact reversal of what we saw on the previous chart. We've got one group of people who are saying, I really can't expand my spend on a day-to-day basis, and another group ready to spend when the moment takes them, because they're the people who benefit from those savings that we saw right at the beginning. And the implication of this for businesses looking to win in this environment is you need to balance your strategy. So you need to think about how you can deliver against both parts of these needs. And importantly, you need to understand where you stand on the spectrum in terms of your reliance on people on the right-hand side of these charts versus people on the left-hand side of these charts. So as an example, here we've taken the top 500 branded manufacturers in FMCG and distributed them in terms of the proportion of their sales that come from struggling households in the last 12 months. And what you see, because the average the number for the total market is 16%, the largest number are somewhere in that 15 to 20% range, and they're the businesses that will have to balance their strategy and appeal to both groups. There are some, however, right over on the left-hand side who take almost no business from those struggling households and can focus much more on benefiting from that larger disposable income and those willing to splash out. And there are others way over on the right-hand side for whom more than 30% of their business is coming from those who are struggling, who really need to focus on how they can deliver what those people who are trying to manage their budgets need. We haven't got time to demonstrate where every manufacturer sits on that spectrum, but just to give you a sense, here's an example of one brand or business within each of those 6 buckets, just to give you a sense of that distribution. Now that adds complexity to your strategy planning. So how do I plan not just to win with one consumer group, but how do I plan to win with multiple? And we're hoping to add some more simplicity, or at least simplify that conundrum for you. And the way we've done that is we've taken lots of the situational and behavioural data we already have about our panel. So who they are, where they live, how many children they've got, what their income is. And all of that behavioural data that we track on a day-to-day basis, what they buy, how they eat, etc. And combined it with lots of the attitudinal data that I've just been describing, in the sense of their general attitudes, their financial situation, their financial outlook, but also their level of optimism for the future. And we've taken all those things together and built a segmentation that takes into account 2 of the key variables that we've been talking about, specifically how comfortable do I feel with my current financial position and how optimistic do I feel about the future. And that gives us 4 groups. So we split the comfortable group into 2, those who are optimistic about the future and those who are pessimistic, the optimists being labelled safe established and the pessimists being labelled realists. And then we've also split the struggling group into defying, so those who are struggling financially today but pretty optimistic about what the future might hold, and the vulnerable, who are the opposite, so those who are struggling but are also pessimistic about what comes next. And the power of this is that we can then connect it to those other pieces of information about their situation, so who they are, but also their behaviour. So are these people behaving differently as well? And we've seen some evidence of that, but I think probably the most powerful evidence of the fact that these groups of people do genuinely behave very differently in response to the same stimulus is by looking right down at a brand level and looking at the performance of specific brands across those 4 groups. And on the left-hand side here, we've got Febreze, which is a brand which is performing really well with the safe established group, so the year-on-year growth of 24%, but struggling with the vulnerable group, so declining by 8%. So winning on one side, losing on the other. And if we move to the right-hand side of the chart, we've got Robinsons, which is doing exactly the opposite. So winning very strongly with the vulnerable group, but losing with the safe established group. So brands that are getting something right, but struggling to balance that strategy and win at both ends of the spectrum. And then we can take that a stage further and we can start to explore what's happened with those brands that has created that pattern. So we take Febreze first, and Febreze had the most successful innovation in FMCG in 2020, which was the bathroom air freshener that you see on the screen here. In its first 6 months of launch, it did a great job of reaching all sorts of consumers. So we're looking at the percentage of sales coming from our segmentation that we've talked about. So 23% of sales from vulnerable is actually an over-index in terms of performance with that group. But as that innovation has become less of a novelty and more of an established everyday product, the proportion of sales from that vulnerable group have tailed off dramatically, driving decline for the brand amongst that group. But in contrast, the innovations continue to perform well with the safe established. So it's an innovation that has worked well with one group, but struggled to maintain its original promise with the struggling group. On the right-hand side, we talked about Robinsons, which is quite a different story. So instead of talking about innovation strategy, here we're talking about tactics, and specifically promotional tactics. So the primary promotional mechanic for Robinsons in the year of 2020 was a 2 for 250 deal. So a deal that incentivizes people to buy more and appeals to those with that elasticity in the amount they're willing to spend, i.e. the more comfortable groups. In 2021, the strategy has moved towards much more single unit price reductions, so selling at either £1 or £1.25, which appeals very strongly to those struggling groups who are trying to manage their budgets, but fails to take advantage of the potential for expanded consumption amongst those comfortable groups, and that's why we see decline in that group. So we see 2 examples here of brands getting it right at one end but not right at the other, and this challenge of how you balance both your innovation strategy, your in-store tactics, and even your communication strategy to make sure that you're not winning at one end of the spectrum and losing at the other. And I think that message applies with all 3 of the things we've explored. Lucy talked to you about context and the idea that more varied working habits are changing the way in which we're going to spend, and we need to understand that divergence in that behaviour. Craig talked about priorities and the fact that people are going to be balancing the risk and reward, and how they judge that is going to vary dramatically per individual and per circumstance. And again, we need to understand the variance in that. And finally, we talked about means and the fact that people's financial situations have gone in very different directions. People's optimism for the future have gone in very different directions. And again, that is exhibiting itself in very different buying behaviour. So if we were to leave you with one thought, it would be that lockdown has dispersed your consumers in all sorts of different directions, and it's never been more important to understand both where your current and your potential buyers are headed. So thanks for listening to the session, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us over lunch to discuss how to grow in a divided nation. We've got a little bit of time now to take some of the questions that are coming in through the presentation. So myself and Lucy have about 10 minutes, and we will kick off with one of the questions that came through fairly early in the presentation. How much do you expect these changing priorities or behaviours to eventually settle down, or is this the beginning of more constant change?
I think that's a really good question, because I think there's 2 things to consider there. One, talked about already, the context that we're living in changed dramatically over the last 18 months. We were doing things in very, very different ways, behaving inevitably in very different ways. And for some people, those behaviours have become quite fixed now. And again, a lot of those, depending on how your actual day-to-day life and your day-to-day routine may have changed, have also become quite fixed. So I think what we're going to see over the next few months is some of those behaviours will stay, and we will keep those behaviours that we've picked up in the periods of lockdown and more restricted measures. Whilst others of those, as people start to go back to work more frequently, if that's one of the impacts, you will start to see some of the previous behaviours. But I think that the key point is it's a bit of yes and no, it's both. I think some of those behaviours are now so ingrained in people that they're not going to suddenly just go back to how they were before.
Yeah, and if we see, for example, in the entertainment sector, there's products out there which weren't available at the start of lockdown, and that means that the chance of going back to how things were before, it's not relevant because the market has shifted considerably. So plenty of different factors at play.
Exactly, and what you were talking about in your section as well is very much around how people's priorities might have shifted, and again the way that they view the world has changed because of what has been quite a dramatic event. So again, I think to say that we're all just going to revert back to exactly how we were pre-pandemic, I don't see that happening at all, really.
Very good. So the next question that came through was about the media getting carried away with one aspect of a story. So the example of everyone going mad for the Peloton bikes over lockdown. Is there any advice on how to persuade internal stakeholders not to run off down rabbit holes? And I think that's a really good kind of observation, and aligns nicely to the idea of the segmentation that we talked about in the final section that Andrew presented. Not every brand will be relevant for the trends that we've identified. Certain brands will be more impacted by positive trends around health or potential trends towards indulgence, for example. So understanding how you sit on things like those trends, the financial security and how people are feeling about that, where you sit will really help you understand what is the right kind of trends to go after, and we have that kind of, obviously, the ability to delve into that in more detail for your brands. So if you just get in contact with either ourselves or your client service representative, if you work with World Panel, and we can break that down into more detail for you.
Yeah, I think the other thing around that as well is that it's very easy, and again, the media likes a very clear, easy thing that you can highlight. And actually what I found really fascinating is when you look at the data behind that, and it was kind of similar to the work from home piece that I was talking about, in that if you look at the news was basically implying, oh, everybody's now working from home and this is a massive, massive change. But actually, even at the height of the pandemic, when we were all locked in as much as we could be, only a third of people were working from home. So, a third of people is still a lot, but it's not everybody. And I think that's the key thing, is that it's about remembering that there are big headlines and there are sort of stories that get people's attention, but when you dig a little bit deeper and look at the data behind it and the behaviour behind it, it's more nuanced than that. So that would be my advice, is that you've got to think beyond the headline and what is the actual nuance underneath.
Yeah, especially when really challenging how your experience is quite different from what the broader populations might be. But
absolutely,
obviously, I'm sure for the majority of the audience, you're probably watching at home, and you might have been working at home for the last 18 months as well. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions coming in about the segmentation. So can the idea that the segmentation be used at retailer level? And can we plot how the retailers fit against the dependence on the different groups that we identified?
Yeah, so absolutely. The idea behind the segmentation is obviously it's applicable for a brand, category, for retailer. It can be used universally. So I think that the key answer, is basically yes, you can use it in that way, and you can look at it for different markets as well. So looking at it from an entertainment perspective as well, looking at it from what's happening in the out-of-home market as well. It's not just about the grocery retailers. These things effectively are universal to how people are consuming and behaving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so, because it's obviously around very general statements about how people are feeling and their attitude, it doesn't necessarily just relate to the grocery market. So,
absolutely.
So we have it mapped on the entertainment panel, for example, there as well. So one more question that is coming through is about the Byron Sharp model of, I think it's a Byron Sharp wrote How Brands Grow, where it identified target broadly. And how does that idea that I identified fit with this consumer division? Can you do mass marketing nowadays? And again, I guess the whole idea behind our presentation was showing that through real examples that people are behaving quite differently versus where they were, and there's no idea of this kind of shared average in the way that they used to be, and that for different brands to overperform, they do have to probably tweak their offerings to the certain consumer groups that they're targeting at, or understand that the behaviour that they push themselves towards will impact the performance amongst another group who are feeling quite differently. So, it's an interesting question. I guess it's something that we can delve into in more depth as we kind of unpick the learnings from the segmentation. But really, in my mind, it feels more complicated than ever to understand the consumer base, and things like this segmentation at this moment is a really good way of doing that, I think.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree. I think it very much comes down to what's happened in the last 18 months has been, I think to say it's been unprecedented is a cliche now. We know it's nothing like this has happened before, and it's had a huge impact, and it has scattered people. And as we are now coming out of it, what we're starting to see is where are they regrouping? Because you can't say, everyone that is, say, over 55 has behaved in one very specific and generic way, because within that, obviously, you'll know yourselves within people that people may have they may be the same age, they may be the same level of affluence, but they have a very different reaction to what's happened and how they're going to behave, how they behave during the pandemic, which is still ongoing, but during lockdowns, and how they're going to behave ongoing. And I think that's a key thing that really, partly based on the segmentation, but just generally that we really need to understand is what are those things that have pulled people apart and put them into those different groups, and therefore how can we understand what they're going to do next and where they're going to go and what their priorities are. And again, I think that one is really, to me, is really key in that this whole shift, everything that's happened the last 18 months, we keep coming back to it, but we've lived our lives in completely different ways. And so many people, I know it in my life, and I'm sure you do as well, Craig, that people that the way that they've reacted has been very, very different, and what they're planning to do next and how they're going to, shop in the next few months, how they're going to consume any entertainment. Obviously, we mentioned Bond in your section, they had the premiere last night.
Yeah.
There's definitely people that I know that have been straight back to the cinema, and then people who are regular cinema goers before are maybe still a little bit reluctant. So really digging into that in more detail, I know I keep saying it, but I just think it's so important to understand all of these different parts, that it does have an impact, because there's always that thing it's about physical and mental availability for any brand or for any product. But a lot of that is also to do with how people feel about their comfort level of being back out, and then their level of affluence and what they can afford to spend. So I think it's a bit too, I think the point that we're trying to make is that there is still nuances, and people are still going to behave very, very differently as a result of what they've experienced in the last 18 months.
I think that's a good point to wrap up, I would say. Thanks very much for joining us. If you have any further questions, feel free to send them on and we can pick that up separately. But that's, I guess, farewell from me.
And yeah, thanks very much.
And see you again soon. Thank you very much.